An unnamed father of Jesus. Although only Matthew and Luke assert the virgin birth of Jesus, and the teaching is found nowhere else in the New Testament, the belief that Mary's pregnancy resulted from a divine act of God without any male involvement developed into a fundamental theological dogma in early Christianity. For millions of Christians, any suggestion that Jesus was conceived through the normal process of human sexual reproduction, even if somehow sanctified by God, is viewed as scandalous, if not outright heresy. But history, by its very nature, is an open process of inquiry that cannot be bound by the dogmas of faith. The assumption of the historian is that all human beings have both a biological mother and father, and that Jesus is no exception. That leaves two possibilities. Either Joseph or some other unnamed man was the father of Jesus. Scholars who question the literal truth of Matthew and Luke's birth stories have suggested that they are a way of affirming the divine nature of Jesus as Son of God by giving him an extraordinary supernatural birth. It is easy to imagine that early Christians who believed Jesus was every bit as exalted and heavenly as any of the Greek and Roman heroes and gods would appropriate this way of relating the story of his birth. It was a way of affirming that Jesus was both human and divine. But there is another possibility. When you read the account of Mary's unsuspected pregnancy, these seem to be real people living in real times and places. In contrast, the birth stories common in Greco-Roman literature have a decidedly legendary flavor to them. The gospel narratives, despite their miraculous elements, ring true. What if the virgin birth stories were created not to present Jesus as a divine Greco-Roman style hero, but to address a shockingly real situation, Mary's pregnancy before her marriage to Joseph? All four women that Matthew mentions in his genealogy had sex out of wedlock, and at least two of them became pregnant. By naming these particular women, Matthew seems to be implicitly addressing Mary's situation. There are some indications in our Gospels that the charge of illegitimacy was circulating behind the scenes. Mark is our earliest Gospel, written around 70 A.D. He includes an important scene in which Jesus returns home to Nazareth as an adult. There is a buzz about him among the townsfolk. Notice carefully their language. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? Matthew uses Mark as a source and includes the same story, but notice how he cleverly rephrases things. Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? This subtle but critical shift in wording is absolutely telling. Calling Jesus the son of Mary, Mark indicates an unnamed father. In Judaism, children are invariably referred to as sons or daughters of the father, not the mother. Mark never refers to Joseph at all. He avoids the paternity issue altogether. Matthew, in contrast, is quick to reshape Mark's wording so that the illegitimacy issue is not even hinted at. We even find that later Greek manuscripts of Mark's Gospel try to fix the scandal by altering the text to read, the son of Mary and Joseph. Here we have evidence of a progressive move to mute or play down the scandal that had been familiar in the hometown village of Nazareth decades earlier. Rumors and gossip die hard and seldom completely disappear. In the Gospel of John, things are even more explicit. At one point, Jesus was in Jerusalem sparring with his Jewish critics. The conversation became very heated and almost turned violent. One of their responses to Jesus was the startling assertion, "We were not born of fornication," as if to imply, "as you were." This was an obvious attempt to undermine Jesus' standing by reference to a rumor about his illegitimate birth. Surely it is no accident that Mark and John, the two Gospels that say nothing about Jesus' birth, and little or nothing about his father, seem to preserve for us these subtle hints of the charge of illegitimacy. Both Matthew and Luke try to mitigate the issue by claiming Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, but both of them freely admit that Joseph was not the father. All four seem to agree Joseph was not the father of Jesus. This charge of illegitimacy is not limited to these four Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered in Upper Egypt at a place called Nag Hammadi by an Arab farmer who was digging in the area for fertilizer. It had been sealed in a clay jar and buried in a field, along with a dozen other lost Christian texts, all written on papyri in ancient Coptic. It was likely hidden in the late 4th century to protect it from Orthodox Christians who would have destroyed it as heretical. Many scholars date it as early as the 2nd century A.D. It is clearly the most precious lost Christian document discovered in the last 2,000 years. It contains 114 sayings of Jesus. Some have called it a fifth gospel in that it supplies so many missing pieces of Jesus' teaching, otherwise lost and forgotten. Toward the end of the collection, in saying 105, Jesus tells his disciples, "One who knows his father and his mother will be called the son of a whore." Many scholars have found in this cryptic saying an echo of the ugly label that Jesus had faced throughout his life, namely, that his mother Mary had become pregnant out of wedlock. The implication is that the charge was unjust and that Jesus knew the circumstances of his birth as well as the identity of his unnamed and absent father. So if Jesus' father was not Joseph, who might it possibly have been? And what circumstances led to Mary being accused of fornication and labeled a whore? If we were filling out Jesus' birth certificate, we would have to put down Father Unknown. But the case is not entirely closed. There are stories and rumors that circulated quite early, and there is a name, Pantera, that seems to crop up here and there with some consistency. The earliest version of the Pantera story comes from a Greek philosopher named Celsus. In an anti-Christian work titled On the True Doctrine, written around 178 AD, he relates a tale that Mary was pregnant by a Roman soldier named Pantera and was driven away by her husband as an adulterer. It is unlikely that Celsus invented this name or the occupation of the man he insists was the biological father of Jesus. He is repeating what he's heard circulating in Jewish circles. The name itself appears even earlier. There is a dispute among early rabbis as to whether it is permissible or not to heal a snake bite in the name of Jesus, son of Pantera. These early sources say nothing of why Jesus would be called son of Pantera, nor do they identify Pantera as a Roman soldier. In Judaism, when you want to identify a person, you attach the name of the father. That is the clear sense of these earliest references. They are intended to identify, not to malign. The evidence shows that the early Christians took this tradition seriously, and they were not able to easily dismiss it as slanderous rumor. The 4th century Orthodox Christian Epiphanius assumes there is some degree of authenticity in the Jesus son of Pantera tradition, but he explains it by claiming that Joseph's father was known as Jacob Pantera, thus making the name a part of the family. We now know that Pantera was a Greek name that shows up in a number of Latin inscriptions from the period, especially as a surname for Roman soldiers. In 1906, the great German historian Adolf Deissmann published a short article that detailed the various ancient inscriptions that used the name Pantera in and around the 1st century AD. One particular example he cited stood out. It was the inscribed tombstone of one Tiberius Julius Abdes Pantera, discovered in a Roman cemetery in 1859 at Bingerbrook, just 12 miles north of Bad Kreuznach, where the Nahe River meets the Rhine. Deissmann included a photo showing the carved figure of a Roman soldier with the neck and head broken off, and a clearly preserved Latin inscription under his feet that read, Tiberius Julius Abdus Pantera of Sidon, age 62, a soldier of 40 years' service, of the first cohort of archers, lies here. Deisman noted that this particular Pantera had died in the middle of the 1st century A.D. and had come to Germany from Palestine. I was intrigued with this unlikely convergence of name, date, and place. I decided that I would try to track down this tombstone and find out the details of its discovery. In 2005, I found that the town of Bad Kreuznach boasted a museum of Roman antiquities called the Ruhmerhalle. My heart skipped a beat when I read that among its treasures was a collection of tombstones of Roman soldiers discovered at nearby Bingerbrook in 1859. I contacted the curator of the museum, and I was pleased to learn that not only was the tombstone of Tiberius Julius Abdus Pantera safe and on display, but the curator had a thick file of archives she would open for my examination, detailing the original discovery, including funerary urns and coins. I decided to examine these materials firsthand. I had never imagined my research on the historical Jesus would take me to Germany. Was it remotely possible that I would soon be standing before what might be an authentic relic of the family of Jesus? These questions were on my mind in the summer of 2005 as I flew to Frankfurt, Germany, and took an early morning train to the little town of Bad Kreuznach. Bad Kreuznach was an important outpost in Roman times, and the surrounding countryside is thick with ancient Roman ruins. It is easy to overlook how important this German frontier was to the Romans in the time of Jesus. It was the Vietnam or Iraq of its day. Countless Roman soldiers were transferred to remote outposts in Germany, and thousands died and were buried there. But what does this have to do with the father of Jesus? At the Ruhmerhalle Museum, I had ample time to photograph, measure, and closely examine the gravestone of Tiberius Julius Abdus Pantera. I learned that the names of Tiberius Julius are cognomens or acquired names. They indicate that Pantera was not a native-born Roman, but a former slave who became a freedman and received the rights of Roman citizenship from Tiberius Caesar for his service in the army. The name Abdes is Pantera's praenomen or given name. It is a Latinized version of an Aramaic name Ebed, meaning servant of God, indicating that Pantera was of Semitic or even Jewish background, whether native-born, a convert, or from a family sympathetic to Judaism. Abdus Pantera was from Sidon, a coastal town of Syria-Palestine just north of Tyre, which is less than 40 miles from Sepphoris. We know that this particular cohort of archers had come to Dalmatia, now part of present-day Croatia, in the year 6 A.D. from Palestine, and was moved to the area of the Rhine and the Naha rivers in 9 A.D. It should not surprise us that Pantera died and was buried in Germany, as were so many thousands of other Roman soldiers who fought in the terrible frontier wars. So what might we conclude regarding Abdus Pantera? Is it remotely plausible that among all the thousands of tomb inscriptions of the period, this might be the tombstone of Jesus' father, and in Germany of all places? There's no way to prove a connection with this type of evidence short of DNA test of identifiable remains. It is also important not to assume that being the son of a Roman soldier necessarily implies something negative. Several Roman officers were praised for their spirituality and piety in the New Testament, and some were part of Jesus' earliest following. It was a Roman centurion who declared of Jesus at his death, "Surely this was a Son of God." Some who give historical weight to the Jesus son of Pantera tradition have suggested that perhaps a Roman soldier raped Mary. Given the times and the turbulent circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth, such a possibility exists. As jolting as such an idea initially sounds, some have found in this scenario a compelling expression of acceptance and unconditional love, certainly by Mary as the mother, but also Joseph as the husband willing to adopt the child as his own. An alternative would be that Mary became pregnant through a relationship she had chosen. Had she formed a prior relationship with another man? Was the pregnancy perhaps before her engagement to Joseph? Pantera may well have left the area and never even learned about the pregnancy. Our Pantera, buried in Germany, would have been a younger man closer to Mary's age at the time of the birth of Jesus. From a historian's point of view, this question in particular should be left open. Even though Matthew and Luke represent Mary as pregnant after her engagement, since neither believes Jesus had a human father, their representation should not be taken as the final word. Mary might well have become pregnant first, and her engagement then subsequently arranged by the family and accepted by Joseph with knowledge of the situation. My point is that we simply do not know. Jesus' enemies would have made the worst of things and freely used the labels fornication and whore. There is no reason to endorse their assumptions. When it comes to family scandal, unwed pregnancies, and broken engagements, the street gossip of a rural Galilean village is the last place we want to turn for any objectivity. I'm convinced that our best evidence indicates that Joseph, who married the pregnant Mary, was not the father of Jesus. Jesus' father remains unknown, but possibly was named Pantera, and if so, was quite possibly a Roman soldier. The gravestone in Germany, whether that of Jesus' father or not, like the ossuaries in the tombs in Jerusalem we have studied, reminds us that these names associated with Jesus' family are grounded in the material evidence that archaeology continues to uncover. These were real human beings who lived and died in a past that is becoming increasingly accessible to us. So if Jesus was not the son of Joseph, but Mary was married to him and bore other children after Jesus, we might assume that Joseph would be the father of the rest of the family. But as is often the case when it comes to a family, particularly a royal family, things are never quite so simple.